Your show will go live in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Broadcasting live. It's America's longest running talk show on computers. It's Computer America, bringing you the biggest names in technology with guest interviews, new products, and your emails. Listen live at computeramerica.com on any device around the world. Email the show at live@computeramerica.com or find us on social media. Be sure to check out our website for contests, giveaways, show notes, live video stream, podcasts, and more. You're listening to Computer America.
Hello and welcome into the Computer America Show. We are the nation's longest running, nationally syndicated radio talk show on computers and technology. I'm your host, Ben Crossman. Thank you for joining us, and what a great show we have for you today. I know I say that every day, but I really mean it this time, I promise. So today on the show, if you haven't had a chance to look at the website, we have theScore, and we are specifically talking about the eSports section of theScore. So obviously theScore, they're a great publication that does sports and fantasy and all that kinds of things, but a section and really a part of the sporting industry, because really one is bleeding over into the other, is esports, and the idea that e-athletes and people who play computer games competitively, well, they're making their niche, they're making their mark, and here to talk about their new part is Kyle Chatterson of theScore. So before we get to that, though, a few things I need to mention, including computeramerica.com. That's where you'll find everything from links to our guest website, any articles that we do, any just anything that we mention here on the show. We have it in one place so that if you're driving, if you happen to be somewhere working or doing something else, well, we got you covered. While you're there, be sure to check out the live video stream where you can watch Computer America, not just listen. It's a lot of fun. Check it out. And hey, just another way to experience the show. And then the last thing is the social media contest. Still going on. Logitech is giving away a great prize every single Friday, and you can enter like 8 different times to win that. Check it out, all at computeramerica.com. So let's, I really don't want to dilly-dally here. Why don't we bring on our guest? And again, we have Kyle Chatterson. He is the Director of Content and Partnerships for theScore, and here to talk with us all about esports. What is esports, and what that means to traditional sporting publications and traditional kind of news outlets. So, Kyle, thank you for joining us here on Computer America.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Ben.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. So, yeah, I mean, this is something that we've definitely covered here on the show before. Definitely like to continue the coverage. And we've seen, the industry, obviously because sports has already been well established. There's a lot of there's a lot of news coverage, there's a lot of organizations, there's a lot of, let's face it, things like fantasy and gambling, and just a lot of industry around sports that we're seeing the rise of esports really take off in a very serious way. So before we get, I apologize, before we even get into that, though, we should actually know about Kyle. Who's Kyle Chatterson? Could you tell us a bit about theScore for anyone who may not know it, and a bit about yourself? How did you get involved?
Sure. So I'll start with theScore. theScore, we've been around in Canada for a while. We're based out of Toronto. Was a TV station that covered primarily sports up to about 5 years ago, and then for a few years before then, obviously. And when they sold off to one of the media interests within Canada, they kept their digital assets, kept the brand name, and spun it out to go entirely mobile. So they started covering sports for all the mobile users, what at the time was a very new and burgeoning industry. As they developed into the number 2 sports app in North America, we are the top challengers to ESPN. They saw there was a need to cover this growing section of esports the same way that sports has been being covered. So we have a core competency around, bringing really great mobile coverage to sports. Just turned that into eSports. They brought me on 2.5 years ago to kind of build and lead that department, and that's kind of where we are now. We started with 3 of us 2.5 years ago. We're up to a team of about 42, I believe, spread across video, editorial, data coverage, and we cover all the major eSports news.
Right.
For myself, I've been a gamer for a long, long time. I'm a nerd. I wear that with a badge of honor. I've been playing video games since I was a young kid, and got the chance. I worked in kind of a normal business role before this for a different company, and saw the chance to work in what I really enjoy and what I think many people would consider a dream job. Certainly, what I still consider a dream job. And I took the leap and have been happy ever since that. But it's taken me to some pretty weird and fun places.
Right. Yeah. And, kind of expanding on what you just touched on. I mean, obviously this is something new. You've only come into your position about 2.5 years ago. I think there's still a lot of even, the Computer America audience that, outside of the target demographic, which right now probably needs to expand. It's, the teenagers, 18 to 25, 18 to 35, male skewing audience, whatever. You kind of say that, hey, there's a competitive video game association or scene, or however you want to say it. I mean, how much pushback have you gotten either in the professional world, in journalism, or, maybe from family, friends, what have you? I mean, are you still sensing a kind of a pushback from the idea that, video games can be a profession? There's a living to make in esports?
So it was actually something that I was, I don't want to say concerned about, but I was curious about when I got in. And again, we were a traditional sports company before that. And I was curious what everybody that worked on the sports side would think as we started to build out, something around people just playing video games and watching other people play video games. But everybody in our office, from all the execs right down to everybody that covers sports on a day-to-day basis, was actually really excited for it. I think most people that do follow sports in around that I'm lucky enough to know, I guess, sees it as a competition as well. They realize what the draw of it is. Professionally, not as much pushback as I would have thought. You get people that they don't want to push back so much as they just don't know. But I found that most people they're pretty good about knowing what they don't know, and everybody's looking to reach the demographic that esports is very good at reaching. So they're a lot more curious and a lot more interested in trying to find out as much as they can about this, because I think about 2 years ago, we've kind of crossed the threshold where it went from being truly niche to being an actual powerful market driver itself. Right. So it went from being something that people could almost ignore and it wouldn't have that big of an impact on anything to, all right, we really do have to get our ducks in a row so we can figure out what to do with this whole esports thing.
Right.
That being said, I mean, I've been in this for 2.5 years, and I'm still answering questions from my family and friends being like, wait, you actually still work in video games? Or like, how is this even a thing? And I think every time there's a major event, for us up in Toronto, they had the NALCS finals last year in August at the ACC, so where all of our major sports are played out of. And we had a lot of family and friends. We had some of our partners come in, and to see the ACC filled up to the brim with completely sold out with gamers that just wanted to watch their favorite players, I think changes a lot of perception, because you can say, hey, it's video games, it can't be that serious, but when you see the amount of passion that these people actually have for following their team, for getting behind their favorite players, for being part of the play, it's hard not to feel like it's a big part of the it's hard to feel that it's just not something special.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, just like you, I've been following esports for a little while now, and it certainly has its own appeal, separate from sports, because, it may even be kind of on the same level as sports, but it's, you can go play football, but you're never going to play on a full-fledged, professional team and blah, blah, blah. But, with esports, any game that you particularly enjoy, there's going to be a competitive element to it that you can that you can aspire to, that you can watch and try to emulate yourself. So, I mean, there certainly is a draw. And like you just mentioned, traditional companies and other companies, they're taking note, traditional organizations. And this is something that I found really interesting. I'm seeing it more in Europe with, League of Legends is kind of my, go-to game. Not too much into CSGO, but, it is what it is. But with League of Legends, the organizations that are starting and coming up and and kind of sponsoring teams, they're not just like Pepsi and it's the Pepsi team, whatever, but instead it's football teams, it's other sporting teams are actually sponsoring a competitive esports element to it. So, I mean, can you explain a little bit more about major companies, existing companies, kind of getting themselves drawn into esports? Because it's not just Coke, Doritos, and Razer. I mean, it's companies from all over.
Yeah, I'll touch on two different points here. So the first is we'll just talk about these teams that are coming into the space. So with League of Legends specifically, there's franchising in the works for next year. And with that going hand in hand, we are seeing a mix of people. We're seeing traditional sports organizations pick up teams. We're also seeing large financial organizations or financial backing and seed funding coming into these companies, coming into these teams from companies that are tied to traditional sports in other ways. For example, Counterlogic Gaming was just got a large injection of cash from the company that owns Madison Square Garden. We have Immortals being backed by a few different investment arms through Memphis Grizzlies, through AEG, which is a company that owns like LA Live, where like the Lakers play. We've got the Misfits in Europe are owned by the Miami Heat, and then in Overwatch League we've got Robert Kraft getting into that. We've got Jeff Wilpon from the Mets, who's also bought into an Overwatch team as well. We're seeing a lot of a big spread of these teams. It's not just necessarily if you own a sporting franchise that you are also looking into this. If you own a venue, you're looking into this. If you're just looking to kind of capture a younger audience, you're looking into this. So I think it's interesting that people are just looking at all the different opportunities that are available, because esports used to be very online, but I think now you're starting to see the appeal of having these big events, these large stadium events, and if you have access to a stadium, you own a stadium, you want to be able to fill those days as well, and you're bringing a different crowd, you're bringing in, and you're being able to basically just tie that to another brand. For the sports brands themselves, getting involved with the NBA 2K League that's starting up, I believe it's next year. There was an NFL league that ran this year for Madden. These are teams that are looking at cable rates and seeing the drop-offs of in each generation of people are cord cutting. Cord cutting is just a growing trend. It's likely to continue. How do you build a younger fan base? I mean, I'm relatively old in esports, but I'm still of the generation where I grew up, watching sports with my dad. I'm a small town kid. I grew up idolizing everything in Toronto. I wanted to, I was a fan of the Jays. I was a fan of the Raptors. I was a fan of the Leafs. That is what I kind of grew up on, but that's because I had cable. If you didn't have cable, you don't really fall into being able to follow sports anymore. So if you look at the generation that is now growing up between the ages of 5 and 14, a lot of them are growing up or have grown up on YouTube, have grown up on Twitch, places where traditional sports don't really play. And if you don't build these relationships or memories, some attachment to your team, to your brand, at an early age, it's really hard to get them interested later on. So these teams are picking up, for example, the Raptors. They've picked up a team for the NBA 2K League for next year. They're looking at how they, can kind of get younger fans that may not be attached to traditional sports to becoming Raptors fans. And I think that's just going to be something that plays across the entire industry. This is a way that you can speak to a lot of the youth today and find a market for your brand, for your teams, and possibly turn these guys into fans of, not just your League of Legends team, but your entire brand. If you're a fan of the Misfits, and you're like, oh, well, these guys are part of the Miami Heat, maybe I'm going to start following the NBA a little more closely because I want to see how the Heat are doing year in and year out. Yeah.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And, let's touch on, I think, audience size, maybe, cash flow through the entire esports scene because, as I think we've mentioned before here, the audience does skew young. It does skew male, blah, blah, blah. There's plenty of room for esports to grow. So let's, do you have any kind of stats or numbers or anything you can kind of throw out to maybe quantify where it is and maybe where you think it's going?
Yeah, there's one thing I just want to kind of add a caveat to this is I think the term esports gets thrown around a lot to mean this entire scene, but esports is not really a single homogenous group of people, right? It's the same way that sports, it's an idea. But if you're not really a sports fan, you tend to follow a few different sports at a much higher level than anything else. I mean, for me personally, I follow UFC and I follow the NBA. So I'm a sports fan, but those are what I have my biggest interest in. For you, as you mentioned earlier, you follow League of Legends. Like, you're an esports fan, but you know more about League of Legends than anything else. So we're seeing, for us, there is not a huge amount of crossover yet. There tends to be fan bases for each of these games. And while there is some cross-pollination, a lot of them kind of exist as their own environments. So to talk about for numbers, I'm going to actually just talk about League of Legends as that kind of standalone environment because it is the one that puts out kind of the most consistent numbers for us to check on a year-to-year basis. For the finals last year, League of Legends drew 43 million unique viewers for the finals and 14.7 million peak concurrent viewers at one time, and that was on across Twitch and YouTube. Now, League of Legends obviously has a very large presence in Asia, specifically China. So those numbers get larger than games that do not pull as large of Asian numbers, such as CSGO is just not broken into that yet. However, IEM did have some CSGO. It had League. It has a multi-game tournament, and their grand finals at Katowice, which is in March of every year, pulled 46 million viewers this year. So we're starting to see extremely large numbers. There was a data point that was put out, I believe it was 2 years ago, that the number of people watching the League of Legends World Finals was actually larger than the number that watched the MLB World Series and the NBA Grand Finals. And again, a part of that is a function of the fact that esports is a truly global phenomenon. It is something that, as I mentioned, you have fans in China, you have fans in Russia, you have fans in North America, you have fans in Germany. Like, everywhere in the world, there's people watching this. It's not tied to just being a predominantly North American thing or a predominantly European thing.
I think that one of my favorite ways to justify this is because obviously even our audience we are Computer America, so we're pretty America centric. But you consider things like the NFL, the Super Bowl, and their average number of U.S. watchers is about 111 million. So esports for some of these large events, they're already touching almost half of that. And we're on Super Bowl 51, 52, whatever it is. Whereas esports is on the League of Legends World Cup 6. It's
yes.
The idea of having everyone connected, easy to watch. I mean, really, esports is easier to follow than it is any traditional sports because you mentioned cable. Not a lot of people have that anymore, or at least not a lot of the target audience does. So, the numbers put up are very impressive. So, awesome for that, definitely. So let's see. Here it is. So let's talk about kind of esports as an individual, because if you wanted to, go through high school and you wanted to tell your parents, I'm going to be the next great quarterback, I'm going to be the next great, shortstop, I'm going to be, an athlete of some sort, they would enroll you in, all the extracurricular activities. They'd put you in leagues, there's a pretty clear-cut path to being an athlete. At least here in the States, I'm sure other places are equally as, at least there's a path. Let's talk about esports athletes. And, these, in a lot of times kids, although, let's face it, year after year, professionals are not losing their edge. You're seeing older and older people, which is great. But, what do you think about e-athletes? Are they athletes? Do you think there's room to develop, let's say, a pipeline to becoming an e-athlete? What's your take on all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to happen. Honestly, I wish I had the answer. I think I could make a lot of money if I had the actual answer for how to deal with this. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you become any of the current generation of esports athletes. It's all homegrown. It's the way esports has been homegrown. Is you get good playing a video game, and then you get to play online, and you can get to the top of a ladder. For League of Legends, if you get to Masters and Challengers, people start to take notice of your name. You start to show up in other big name streamers' games, and you can start to get scouted, try out for teams and whatnot. But up to that point, the only real way you improve is it's all self-driven.
Yeah.
Whether it's making a team yourself or just playing by yourself and grinding solo queue and getting better and taking notes and watching streams, and it's very, very self-driven, which creates, I think, some really interesting characteristics with esports athletes, because you get people that are obviously extremely driven. They're willing to put in just a huge amount of time. They are very naturally talented at this kind of thing, but that also didn't necessarily grow up in a team environment, all of a sudden being forced to play games in a team environment. And I mean, team environments are cruciables, right? If you're playing soccer or hockey, I guess use the stereotypical Canadian example,
right?
You learn very quickly that it doesn't matter how good you are as a single player. It matters about how well you work within your team. So there has been a few examples where you have amazingly gifted mechanical players that just cannot work within a team. And a lot of that could be solved by having an actual pipeline. Whether that is, I mean, are we going to start signing kids up for Sunday morning League of Legends or Sunday morning esports clubs? Like, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I don't know if it's even needed. But I think at some point there's got to be something put in place, and whether that comes from,
I think Blizzard tried to do, and just real quick, I think Blizzard with Overwatch, I think they tried to put in a system. I didn't look into exactly what it was, but I think they're trying to solve that problem of how do you go from enthusiast, just kind of weekend warrior to, someone being scouted by teams, and yeah.
Blizzard and Riot for League of Legends have both put in development leagues, or are attempting to put in development leagues, and I think that solves the issue of when you're getting to 17. But it doesn't. That's very late for development in a lot of sports. Like, how many pro basketball players or pro football players that started playing their game at a high level when they were 17? Like, nobody.
Yeah.
Everybody starts playing, or at least starts developing their skills, when they're still single-digit aged. So I mean, I think the big issue is that it's a very hard thing to tackle when everybody's just willing to play this anyways in their off time. I mean, I think that's one of the great aspects of esports in general. As you mentioned earlier, everybody can play it if you've got a computer. The most popular esports in the games are ones that also are not super demanding on your computer, so they're really inclusive. I think the bigger thing that we need to figure out is how do we kind of increase the longevity of these people's career, because I think that is what would allow a development league. Is right now you almost don't have time to be in a development league in the length of like the average esports career. If you're looking at between 2 and 4 years of a career span, and that's your prime earning time, you don't have the luxury of sitting for 2 years of that and just being like, okay, I'm going to get better at the fundamentals. I'm going to get better working as a team. You have to hope that you get to that top level and you can capitalize as much as possible. And a lot of that comes from the fact that these guys are all playing, 12, 14 hours a day for 6 or 7 days a week for the entire year, out of necessity, because whether it's they haven't found efficiencies in practice yet. I mean, there's a lot more money going in towards analytics and really, how to best use practice time. And I think people are seeing some returns on, maybe we cut out 4 hours of playing and we do 4 hours of physical activity instead, or we do 4 hours of mental coaching or something.
Right.
But ultimately, do you know anybody that can really do something for 75 hours a week for 50 weeks of the year or 52 weeks of the year and not get burnt out after 2 or 3 years?
Yeah.
Not really.
Yeah, and those are the kinds of numbers that streamers do, and streaming is a great way to kind of get yourself out there, to kind of show that you have skills and gain some notoriety, so that you can be picked up. But yeah, you're right. If you don't put those kinds of numbers up, the person that does, even if you are as talented as them, just the person who puts in the most time gets the most exposure and probably has a better chance of being picked up. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to go on to, the development league, back into that idea,
right.
You get collegiate sports, right, that play a very important part in the development of athletes. There's no time for that. I mean, you're getting into situations where the average esports career is lasting less time than the average university education. So how do you even fit that in? I mean, again, as you mentioned, we are seeing more players. Like, it used to be kind of a trope that if you, as you got to 23 or 24, you were too old to play esports anymore because you weren't fast enough, your reactions weren't fast enough, whatever. I think that's very much shown to not be the case. There's been a fair number of studies across reaction time anyways, showing that it really doesn't slow down to a significant degree, which is why I think burnout plays a much bigger part in it. But I mean, that would be the place to kind of go for me, is once we are able to extend the realistic playing time of players, whether it's just through dropping the saturation of tournaments, like, maybe we don't need to have a significant CSGO or Dota tournament every weekend.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the healthier part of actually turning into a franchise league for League of Legends. Is right now their season runs from the 2nd or 3rd week of January into November. and then you get a month off, basically. I mean, you can't really have a life in that time. And well, yes, it's a great gig. I think everybody would love to be a pro gamer. I think the reality is a lot different than what the idealized version of that is, and it leads to people wanting to do something else with their life. Like, I mean, it's amazing. I think the dream of being a pro gamer is still great.
Yeah.
But when you're asked to put the rest of your life on hold for 4 years to do it, you end up starting to crave something else outside of it as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then even when you work for those 11 months and have 1 month off, within that 1 month, teams are negotiating contracts, they're swapping players, you may have to move cities. I mean, you know, that 1 month is still a very active and even more active time than, you know, your on season. So, no, you know, you're right, esports, it's, but these are kinds of the, you know, they're the growing pains, because I think a lot of people, you know, they sit there and they think, well, you know, you can have a large Dota tournament every single weekend because, hey, you know, these guys we're going to be playing anyways. Might as well play them together. They think that, you know, esports is less intensive and therefore can be played more often or something. Like, you're right. Development does need to happen there, you know, for sure. And that's where my favorite example is Echo Fox for League of Legends. They, you know, with Rick Fox, he came in and he really tried to turn the organization, even though it really didn't turn out too well, but he tried to turn the organization into a more professional setting where you didn't just sleep and play in the same room that you lived in. Instead, you went to the office, you worked out, you had a schedule, you know, you had trainers, and, you know, I think you know, esports all over definitely needs more of that. So for sure. So, you know, we talked a lot about esports. It has its own problems. It has a lot of great things going for it. But I guess the idea is when does everyone sit up and take notice? When does it become mainstream in your mind? Because, I mean, if you're judging by a few different metrics, you know, when you reach 40 million views, that's one thing. When you hit cable television, it's done that. It has a huge presence online. When do you think esports will it, and when will it go mainstream?
I mean, I would make the case now that it is mainstream. It may be a smaller part of mainstream, but I would make the case that it's already mainstream. As you mentioned, it's already on cable. It is what a lot of people are you know, starting to grow up watching on YouTube and on Twitch, and you know, like, Twitter is always active around major events. If you look at the International right now, the International itself is like a kind of a cultural touch point because people can't believe that there's a $25 million prize pool in an esports event. Yeah. And it always gets, you know, tons of mainstream coverage. So, like, yeah, we're starting to see multiple different events covered on TV. EVO has made it to TV. The Dota Finals have made it onto TV. E-League is obviously running multiple different events on cable. I really don't know what else it can do. I think at this point it's still, as you mentioned, a ton of room to grow, and it is growing very rapidly. But I think when you talk to a lot of people now, they've at least heard of, if not esports, like professional video gaming. And maybe that's just a nomenclature problem or terminology problem, but I think at this point everybody, or most people that are kind of tuned into that part of society, whether like competitions of some kind, have heard of it. It's been all over ESPN. You know, it's going back to acceptance. One of my favorite things to do is anytime ESPN airs esports is to just watch their Twitter, because that is where you get the real hate of people saying, you know, this isn't a real sport, or get this off my TV. But you know, those numbers are getting smaller and smaller. It's starting to be a vocal minority, and there's always going to be haters. Like, if you're doing something good, there's always going to be haters.
But I mean, it definitely swings both ways. You know, I don't think I've ever seen anyone call the gaming community, the online community, particularly heartfelt. You know, they have their own share of very aggressive fandom, but you know, that's
absolutely
that's gonna always, you know, be there to some extent, and hopefully they too will become the vocal minority, as you know, just acceptance. People acceptance is great. So, hey, Kyle, would you mind staying over for a couple minutes just so we can give this a proper send off?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah. So everyone, we're about to head off to break here, but when we come back, we have a few more questions for Mr. Kyle Chatterson, again, the Director of Content and Partnerships for theScore Inc. Some things we are going to be touching on include the future of esports. I mean, where does this all kind of look in 5-10 years? VR, things like virtual drone racing, virtual reality. Where does that kind of land us? Does that land us in those sci-fi movies that have us controlling people, in prisons and things like that? And some other things, and of course more about theScore. So everyone, stay tuned. More Computer America just after this. Thanks so much.
We are all Brother Wolf. 10 years ago, a group of locals banded together to create positive change. We took animals into our homes, held adoption events at local retailers, and talked to the community about our mission to help build a no-kill Asheville. A decade later, we have achieved so many victories for animals in need. There's been so much progress, yet there's still so much to do. As part of our year-long celebration, we encourage you to become a member of our special Compassionate Circle program. With a monthly donation of $10 or more, you will have behind-the-scenes access to the work we are doing at Brother Wolf. Our goal is to reach 1,000 members because we receive no government funding. Working together, we can help build and sustain no-kill communities. Learn more at compassionatecircle.bwar.org. We are a 501c3 tax-deductible organization.
And welcome back to the Computer America Show. It is 31 minutes past the hour as we continue on here. And yeah, thank you for joining us on the other side of this. For anyone just joining us, welcome into the Computer America Show. I'm your host, Ben Crossman, and we are continuing our conversation with Mr. Kyle Chatterson. So if you missed any part of the interview so far, or you missed the first half of the show, feel free to head on over to Computer America, where we have audio, video archives, as well as podcasts on pretty much any major network that you subscribe to. So welcome back, Mr. Kyle Chatterson, and obviously from theScore, we're talking esports. And yeah, thank you for staying over. And just wanted to kind of get some of the big ones out of the way, because like we've been talking about, you've been doing this for 2 years. You've seen growth that is honestly shocking, because it can't esports started in the 90s in South Korea, and it really didn't pick up much traction. But ever since then, really, 5-6 years ago, I think League of Legends and Counter-Strike Global Offensive really, or even CS 1.6 really pushed it into something, bigger, into something that people could really digest and enjoy watching. I mean, that's, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Where do you see it in another 5 to 10 years?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think that we're already starting to see, fights for broadcast rights for esports. Like MLBAM has picked up the rights to broadcast League of Legends. We're seeing basically, like, people are trying to get a piece of the pie now. I think it's going to stay, or I think esports will stay and should stay a digital thing. It doesn't really fit television, in my opinion, in the way that the current games are set up. We could get into the realm of maybe a game like Overwatch that the rounds are shorter. It can fit the commercial breaks and whatnot. But if you're playing Dota, or you're playing even CS:GO or League of Legends, there's not really time for the commercial breaks, which drive a lot of TV. Also, the games are just long and variable length. There's a lot of logistical issues with putting it on TV. So I think it's going to stay on a digital medium. In terms of just growth, I mean, I think it's going to continue to grow, and I think the biggest changes are going to come in from the games. We haven't really seen a game last longer than, I mean, you can say CS:GO, but it's been multiple iterations of CS:GO. Yeah. We haven't really seen a game last, a decade yet. So I think the first time that we do see a game last a full decade in one iteration or another, and League of Legends is getting very close. Dota, has had a huge amount of longevity as well, but has had multiple iterations. Without really going to a League of Legends 2 or a League of Legends 3, I think will be the first time that you can say this is something that's got staying power.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest question marks for myself, is that games, I think the esports scenes for games, for the individual game, can only be as strong as the support for, the average people. Because, watching the best 50 players in the world duke it out on your favorite game, that's interesting. But if you no longer play League of Legends, if you no longer play Overwatch, if you never, if you don't have the millions of people supporting the game, it's not going to be an active development. People don't care to, game companies won't care to support it. And that entire scene, that entire infrastructure built up around a singular game really doesn't matter at that point. It's going to be more of a matter of diversifying and, not just putting all of your chips into Riot Games, into Blizzard, into Valve. It's definitely going to be, making esports not just a game that is popular, but, maybe a franchise or maybe a league that is popular. So, but to be fair, we did kind of see that with StarCraft Remastered. That was something, interesting to see just a couple days ago. What do you think about StarCraft Remastered?
I mean, I think the whole story of StarCraft and Brood War specifically is really interesting because it is what you mentioned, Korea. It's kind of what brought esports to the forefront in Korea. It was an incredibly popular game over there. It had some popularity in the West, especially with the launch of StarCraft 2. But we saw StarCraft 2 go through its full life cycle, and it came back to, like, they actually stopped doing, a lot of the major leagues over in Korea stopped doing Brood War at all. And then as StarCraft 2 kind of reached the end of its life cycle and started declining, people started clamoring for Brood War again. Yeah. And some of the major tournaments started picking up Brood War leagues again. And I think that's one, a testament to the game itself, and people's feelings towards it. But I don't think StarCraft didn't stay large enough. Like, it basically wasn't able to really support. It had a niche audience that was extremely passionate, but wasn't really something that you could build a large industry around over a large span of time. With the remastered, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I don't know if it will really do anything from a competitive standpoint. I think esports as a whole has kind of moved towards team-based games, with the exception of the fighting game community. But I think the accessibility is becoming a core component. And I think you're starting to see a lot more organizations and developers build their games with esports in mind. And a couple of core components of that are making sure the games are, first of all, accessible and readable for an audience. If you're watching StarCraft for the first time, that is an incredibly complicated game. I mean, I played StarCraft. I was never amazing at it, but I put a decent amount of hours into it, and I think I was platinum at like my highest point. So I at least could understand what was going on. I could in no way replicate what the pros are doing, but I could get it. But if I showed it to friends that had never played, it's really hard to enjoy something that you don't even know what's happening. So I think StarCraft is always going to suffer from that. StarCraft is a great, super fun game. It's just extremely deep and suffers from the difficulty curve. I think League of Legends, one of the reasons that it became successful is people always argue, I guess fans of League of Legends and fans of Dota always kind of have a lot of contention between the two of them because they're both the biggest MOBAs in the gaming world. Yeah. But League made their game, Riot specifically, made League a lot more watchable, easy to pick up, easy to learn. And yes, you get the complaints from Dota that it's Dota easy mode, but you're dealing with trying to have mass market appeal, and you have to make something easier for people to want. You still want to allow the expression of skill, but if I can't understand why it's skillful that you're doing something, then it doesn't matter either way.
And then of course Blizzard tried to emulate that. I mean, all these branched out from Warcraft 3 and Defense of the Ancients and things like that. But and then Blizzard, who of course made the original Warcraft game, they tried to emulate that even further. And if you say that League is a simplified version of Dota, then Heroes of the Storm is a simplified version of League of Legends, and blah blah blah. So, like, I don't think that Heroes of the Storm has as big of a following. They definitely don't. But I think people can still sit down. And I've shown family members the idea of Heroes of the Storm, and they're able to pick that up much easier. I think that's you're right. I mean, there's something to be said for making it complex and very very skill based and things like that. But there's also something to be said for watchability, and that's we talked about what's going to make esports go mainstream. I think increasing that watchability to a point where maybe not dumb everything down, but it has to come to a point where you can sit down with no knowledge and go, oh, that's interesting. Look what he just did. You know, it has to get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, let's move on to maybe the idea of how money gets involved in this. Obviously, we've talked about organizations, but let's talk about brands and sponsorships and advertising. You mentioned that a lot of these games, they don't take kindly to commercial breaks. In fact, I think a lot of the audience for video games, they're used to constant stimulation. They're used to, something always happening, something, someone always talking to them. It's, game. So how do you kind of break that up without, because I've seen a lot of, 30-second, 1-minute commercial breaks that go over like a lead balloon. I mean, it's just not the best way to inject brands into esports. What do you feel is the best way to kind of mix, kind of new marketing and a new medium?
I mean, we've seen the rise of influencer marketing across all of media, all the marketing industry. I think that will play a major component in it, but that doesn't really help, events. I think it's a major challenge for the industry going forward. I guess it's a major challenge for really any digital industry dealing with ad blocker. So you're getting more inline ads, not as many Twitch ads. Like right now, I don't remember what the numbers were, but it's well north of 50% of users on Twitch are using ad block. So I mean, I think it comes down to the generation that's currently the biggest followers, and I include myself in this. We're used to kind of getting something for free. Ads ultimately support what we're doing, and yes, I'm biased. I mean, we're an ad-supported company as well, but
right.
Ultimately, we're not used to paying subscriptions anymore. Going towards the internet, you pay your internet bill, but that's it. You're not really paying a subscription to sites. You're not paying for, I guess, like a package just to watch League of Legends or just to watch whatever your favorite esport is. So I think you're going to see more product placement, more ads that are a little more organic and in line with what the product is, and what the event is. And less of these pieces, less traditional ads. I also think you're going to see, for the most part, what was on Twitch for a while was ads that were, made for TV. I think you're going to see ads being created more for a digital audience. And that will be a big change. And that will only come, obviously, at scale as we start to get larger and larger audiences. But ultimately, it's just something that the entire industry has to adapt to. It's a new audience that has, as you mentioned, much lower attention spans, and they're always looking for something, and they don't really take kindly to being advertised to, even when nothing else is on.
Yeah.
I mean, I know people who will mute and get away from streams as soon as commercials comes on, anyways, just so they can go to another window and read something or watch another video or whatever they choose to do or play a game. So I think the challenge is making it so that your ads and what you're trying to get across come across as organic, or you can really show that you're bringing value to whatever you're being a part of. I mean, we've done some advertising campaigns with some partners that are based around major gaming events, and for us, we wanted to make it clear that we are helping support esports as a whole and growing esports by sponsoring this and by being part of it. Like, yes, we're getting something out of it by getting our name out there as well, but sponsors are ultimately what are paying the bill for a lot of these events. So I think by showing that you're not trying to be the vulture that's circling around and trying to prey on people.
Right.
You're trying to be part of this neat grassroots and organically growing industry.
I have definitely gotten the sense that it's getting better. I think it's just the manner of your audience that you have here with esports. When you are 13 to 17, 18, coming out of high school, you really don't have to think. In your own life or in anyone else's life, how do they pay the bills? How do they keep everything running? And I think as the audience gets older, I think as the appeal spreads. I've never heard my parents once say, "Man, commercials during 6 o'clock news? What is this? This is awful." Like,
yeah,
it's expected. So I think as the industry gets older, or at least the audience for the industry gets older, it's to be expected, and you can kind of shift back to traditional means. But in the meantime, you're right. The more you can align yourself organically, the more you can kind of say, hey, here we support what you support. the better off these brands are going to be. So, all right, let's go ahead and skip forward to another one, and this is something I was really looking forward to, and I think it still needs one or two more innovations to really make it into the home. But virtual reality, in a lot of ways, has a lot to offer. When you want to talk about immersion, this is the same kind of thing that we see with traditional sports like fantasy football and things like that. You can immerse yourself in making your own team and watching your players, tracking stats, blah, blah, blah. That's one sort of immersion. But I think virtual reality has a completely and wholeheartedly better form of it. But at the same time, it hasn't broken into the home yet, and esports, it's non-existent. So, virtual reality is going to develop. Esports, just like them, are going to develop as well. Do you see a place for virtual reality, or is it something that's only going to be used for personal experiences?
I think there's a couple different ways that virtual reality can really get involved with esports, or really, be game changers within esports. The first one is from a spectator standpoint. It's the same way that it's looking at being used within traditional sports. Is you can set up a virtual reality booth and have people feel like they're at the game, because you just put on your headset and you look around. It feels like you're in the stadium. For esports, the big game changer here is you get to feel like you're in the game, right? I mean, Dota actually already allows it, where you can get on with whatever your preferred virtual reality device is, and fly above the map. You're essentially a ghost on the map, and I mean, that's just a completely different way to watch the games that you're already trying to follow. It does take you a little bit out. I mean, I think despite the fact that these are digital games and you're generally involved with video game graphics for the most part, I think people still really do enjoy seeing the human emotion that's attached to any of these plays and to any of the big moments. But from just a gameplay perspective, I think it's going to change the way that games are viewed. In terms of changing the actual games themselves, so I'm going to go back to one of the things I said earlier, where the popular games right now are the games that are the most financially accessible, especially when you're getting into developing countries and countries where there's less expendable income,
right?
Or sorry, disposable income, and that's where League of Legends has been really successful. That's where for CS:GO even has been really successful. Is it doesn't cost that much to actually have. You don't have to have a high-end gaming rig to play. So I think that's one of the reasons you see something like Counter-Strike being more successful as an esport than something like, say, Call of Duty. Call of Duty has a huge player base, and it's extremely popular on the web and on YouTube and whatnot. But from the competitive standpoint, it's really expensive to stay up to date with your whatever the most recent console is, and buying a new version of the game every time a new iteration comes out. So I think by adding virtual reality into that, as it is right now and as it is for the near future, it's going to be a financial block for too many people to really make it mainstream. So I think anything beyond the viewing experience is probably a decade out. After you're able to drop the production cost of virtual reality, it's become much more part of the mainstream. You may see it then. Because then you have a large enough player base that actually has access to it to create a really deep talent pool. However, that being said, I think one of the really interesting things that could come back around is kind of the advent of arcades again. Why arcades were popular in the past is that people really couldn't afford to have all these individual games because they were in arcade consoles. So that's going to come back with the reason I can't have a full VR setup in my place is space and expense. So if you're getting a whole bunch of kids now that are able to go and maybe start playing, whether it's, let's say, a virtual reality Street Fighter or virtual reality, whatever the game can be, you could start to see these kind of grassroots organizations pop up where you get the old style arcade competitions. Between Street Fighter is my favorite. I love Street Fighter in arcades. So
yeah.
I think that that could be a way that it kind of comes up, and it may not be the way esports looks right now. Like, it may not be the same kind of competition, but I mean, I hesitate to label anything as esports realistically because it's new in itself. It's constantly changing. I don't think anybody's really in the position to say, well, this is definitely esports, well, this is not esports. I'd prefer to have the industry and the scene be as large as possible. So I think that's how it could kind of affect esports in the near future.
Yeah, it's and everything you said completely valid. And virtual reality, it's certainly come a long way. It has a long way to go, definitely in affordability. But some of the news and announcements that we've heard from Oculus and from Oculus and Vive, cutting the cord, making it cheaper, blah blah blah. I mean, I think there's a few things that they could do better to to do that, but it's gonna take time, and we'll definitely see what happens. But okay, let's focus a little bit, in these last couple minutes here on on yourself, Kyle. So, 2.5 years doing something that no one else. Let's face it, you can't go to, let's say you have a colleague that has been covering, football for 30 years. Sure, you can, ask them for tips and things like that. But your audience and what you've, and what you kind of write for and what you write about is going to be completely different than any other kind of really journalist out there. So, what are some key lessons that you've learned, while you've been working at theScore of, developing esports and really just trying to, bridge that gap? Anything really stick out to you?
I mean, I think it's I think there's a couple things here. We did learn very early on that we could not translate our sports knowledge like directly to esports, which is something that we kind of expected, but as you mentioned, we did have some learnings from the sports side that we at least wanted to try. Since the first couple months, we've been treating esports entirely as its own thing, and we're very much on the frontier of it. And I mean, I think the big things is just what I mentioned with the marketing. It's the same way with content. You've really got to be authentic. You've really got to like all of our writers love what they do. They love esports. They love video games. And I think that really comes across in their writing. But you are ultimately writing for a very young age group. You mentioned attention spans earlier, and that is a big part of it. People don't want to sift through 3,000 word essays on why a play works. They want to watch a quick clip of the plays themselves instead. They want to see some funny videos or talk about everything is not as serious. You get caught up in this bubble of the really serious esports sometimes, but you realize there's a much larger general audience out there that actually they're watching esports for what it is, which is entertainment, and they want to be entertained. So ultimately, we have to entertain. We hold ourselves to very high journalistic standards, and any news that you see that's coming out, you can guarantee has been validated and has been, checked multiple times across multiple sources. But you kind of have to approach it in two different ways. Like, one is news and one is entertainment. You really have to excel at both to be a player in this industry now. So I think it's basically been finding ways to stay authentic, which is always challenging, but less challenging when you have a team like what we've got here. Again, we have a lot of really passionate people, so I think we're very lucky in that regard. And then just being able to put it all together and get it out there and deal with, as I mentioned, haters earlier. If you're doing a good job, you're going to have haters. And you mentioned with the crowd kind of being younger and being very vitriolic. We get some, what's the nice way to say it? We get some very creative insults thrown our way.
Yeah.
And it just happens. You just kind of got to be able to roll with it and look at the overall engagement that you're getting. There's always going to be people that are not happy with what you're doing, but if you lose one person reading your articles, but you had 100 other people that were very happy with whatever you did this time, you're going to go that way.
Very well said, and I think that applies to a lot of a lot of different industries, not just writing and not just esports, but in life. Really, words of wisdom handed out here on Computer America. But if you have someone telling you that what you're doing, if someone takes time out of their day to put you down and say that they don't like what you do, it means you're doing something that has an impact. And you may not be everything for everyone, but you're going to be something for someone. So obviously that's where your esports section at theScore really really is going. So what's next for you guys? What's next for esports and theScore? I mean, are you looking to do I guess you could draw upon again traditional sports. They have a lot of on-site interviews, live interviews, things like that, but I don't know if that would translate one-to-one. Where do you see kind of press coverage, and specifically your press coverage of esports going?
So press coverage within esports is really interesting because it's actually heavily based out of LA in North America, and then events are obviously all over the world. So they get very expensive to do decent press coverage, which creates a big challenge, especially when you can get a lot of the same people, just on a Skype call or jumping on a podcast. I mean, we do a podcast weekly that has grown to have a pretty decent viewership. that we get a lot of the big names within esports anyways just calling into our show and chatting with us for 20 or 30 minutes, which a lot of the time creates better conversation than catching these guys after playing a game, or catching them when 15 other media outlets are trying to get a hold of them at the same time. And also, I mean, we've seen the demand for some post-game interviews to be high, but it's very inconsistent. There tends to be the cream at the top, and then kind of the rest. And it's not a comment on the quality of the interviews or even the players that you're following, but nobody else is working on making these stories and building and drawing storylines that people want to follow, so it's almost hard to do it by yourself. With that said, obviously our video department has been one of our fastest growing parts of us. We are continually ramping that up. I think there's a lot more that not just us, but like anybody can really do within esports video and within video in and of itself. The other thing that we've done is we've started to create resources to help people play video games. We don't want to necessarily become a guide site.
I noticed that, yeah.
But putting out builds for League of Legends, and I mean, we're already drawing on the data of all these games. We show the data for all these games. So we can also put it out in ways that other people can use it in different formats. So if you want to, build your favorite champion the same way that your favorite player builds that champion, we have a resource for that now. So we're constantly looking for opportunities like that. We want to support all of the esports scene. And I think there is, because it's so new, it's so nascent, there is still so much that we can do, and there's so many opportunities that I don't think there's really a lack of things to build. For us, it's just really setting their priority and getting the wheels turning.
Yeah, I that was one of the first things I noticed, was that you had builds for League of Legends, and of course, how to go to Anivia, my favorite, and yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of resources. You're kind of elbowing your way into a pretty captured market, but at the same time, it's the idea that it kind of goes hand in hand. If you are talking about League of Legends, someone's going to be looking for resources of League of Legends, and it's good to have those resources for them rather than pointing them away. You point them internally. So definitely,
exactly.
I think you're learning a lot. I mean, just from this interview, I'm definitely learning a lot. This is something that we're definitely going to keep following. And I want to say, Kyle, thank you so much for joining us here. Everyone, Kyle Chatterson, the Director of Content and Partnerships. I apologize for keeping you over the hour, but this was a lot of fun. And yeah, thank you for sharing all this with us.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Had a good time.
All right, have a good one. And everyone, there he goes. So, yeah, we'll definitely get him back on. And yeah, that was, again, we were supposed to do computer and technology news. We'll go over some of the news stories that you can check out later today. We'll read the headlines, and then we'll, maybe on our next free day, we will go over them. But in the meantime, I will say that, yeah, that was a great interview. So if you miss any of that, if you want to catch up on it again, computeramerica.com, it has everything and anything that you need to know. So let's see some of the stories that we were unfortunately not able to get to. And there were some here that I really, really, really wanted to talk about, including things like, again, switching from esports to more traditional. We have things like the HBO hack was reportedly up to 7 times larger than the Sony hack. So we haven't really covered that on the show, but HBO, they were hacked. They had scripts. They had, even shows downloaded. Essentially, the entire HBO lineup in some form was hit with this, with this hack. And yeah, it's something that I think networks and content providers are going to have to really watch out for as more and more is stored in a digital medium. Yeah, it's a complete possibility. So let's see. Some of the other ones include the researcher, and this was a big one that I really wanted to get to. We might get to it tomorrow, but the researcher who
90 seconds.
The researcher who stopped the WannaCry attack ransomware, and that was the ransomware that locked up all those Windows XP computers, has been arrested. He was at Defcon. We covered Defcon extensively, and yeah, he was arrested by the FBI. So a lot of hearsay going out. Still a developing story, but supposedly he had a warrant out for his arrest for being part of a Trojan banking
60 seconds.
Trojan banking malware hack back in 2015, and he was indicted. So best not to put yourself in a place where you can be, picked up by the FBI. And, lots and lots of news stories. Check it out, computeramerica.com. Everything and anything you want can be found there. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to Computer America. This was a lot of fun. And hey, why don't we do it again tomorrow and the day after and the day after and the day after? 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern, everyone. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.
The ads were fine.
10 seconds.